Is a participatory economy a blueprint? And how much detail should we go into for a vision for a post-capitalist economy? Find out in this episode of PEP Talk.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Welcome to PEP Talk, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as a participatory economy. I'm your host, Mitchell Szczepanczyk, coming to you from Chicago. We are joined by a panel of commentators who will discuss a question: is a participatory economy a blueprint? We are joined by, from Helsinki, Finland, Antti Jauhiainen, a longtime political economy advocate, writer, and activist. And we are also joined from Portland, Oregon in the United States, Robin Hahnel, professor at Portland State University, co-inventor of the model of a participatory economy. We will ask the question, and I'd like each of you, and I'll also chime in, to take a few minutes to answer the question, is a participatory economy a blueprint? Antti, let's start with you. Is a participatory economy a blueprint?
Well, it's not a blueprint, not in the sort of derogatory sense that it's often used. Actually, what sort of fascinated me about participatory economy, although way back when I was 17 or 18 years old, around 18 years ago, was exactly the kind of thing that I think is important and what people sometimes dismiss as blueprinting, which is that it actually has sort of values and concrete solutions and institutions for the economy, instead of rosy rhetoric. Because when I was sort of a younger activist myself and researching economic issues, I often found out that what troubled me was that there wasn't concrete answers to very crucial questions about spending or infrastructure, or crucially, who gets to say no in an economy. So if obviously I think more and more people feel that capitalism isn't an economic system we hope to have in the long-term future, and one we hope to sort of advance beyond from. But when it comes to actual solutions, one of the most important questions we need to answer is who gets to say no in an economy. And capitalism is very good at this. Capitalism is explicit in saying who gets to say no. That is capitalists. And our economy, a democratic economy, needs to have viable answers to that question. And this is where I think what's often called blueprintism comes from. I think participatory economy is quite unique in not sidestepping this issue. Participatory economy is good in how it handles answering these kind of questions that ultimately will have to be answered if we hope to build a working democratic economy. I think answer depends. Like, we actually need blueprints. We need visions for future economy that provide both values and institutions and how to solve key questions of the economy. What we don't need is vague economies which say that our economy will protect nature. I mean, that's a good thing to say and that's a good value, but without institutions like pollution revealing mechanisms or how to integrate destruction of nature into prices and day-to-day economic activity, they will remain sort of dangerous. They will sort of remain the kind of things that will not help us build a concrete viable economy in the future, and will also affect the discussion on reforms we have today, meaning that we might end up just saying these are the kind of things we want, this is our wish list for Santa. We have no idea how to come up with it. We just have these wishes. Let someone else, maybe someone who has power, to answer them. And I think that's not a good start for discussing the kind of economy we want. So I think we need blueprints to an extent, and I think participatory economy strikes a very good balance in that sense.
Robin, same question to you. Is a participatory economy a blueprint?
I think that there's the reaction. I think the issue arises because people have a very sensible reaction. They say, well, who are you? you're a small group of people who claim to have thought about some things, and you're going to dictate to, the citizens of some future society how they have to go about doing things. Well, of course, that's absurd. That's ridiculous. None of us would ever, pretend that that is what we are trying to do. I think my simple answer to that is, of course, nobody would ever let us do that. On the other hand, if we take a look at the history of people who have tried to implement and build alternatives to capitalism, it becomes apparent that it isn't always clear exactly, how things should be done. And we have plenty of evidence that sometimes when people built alternatives to capitalism, they built alternatives that weren't good alternatives. So really what I see this is as an attempt to, as Antti said, provide concrete answers to let's consider all these decisions. We can make a list of all the decisions that have to be made. And it's important to think about, well, how do you propose those decisions actually be made? And sometimes the reason to propose, actual procedures, concrete blueprint procedures for making certain decisions is precisely to examine their pros and cons, to examine, where would the dangers lie? What would one have to be concerned about if you went about making this decision in this particular way? So it's in that spirit that we have tried to say, let's get something out there for discussion purposes. And I think the other thing that we have asked others to do is, well, if this isn't if you have a problem with this, if you think that this might be problematic in some particular way, well, then what would you propose instead? And often what has happened with leftists is that the answers to those things has been very vague. And in this day and age, another thing has happened, which is, ever since the collapse of the fall of the wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European alternatives, if you go to the literature about, well, what do anti-capitalists want in the 21st century? If you go to that literature, you'll actually see there are very, very different answers that people are giving. And so that's another reason that we think it's very important to provide concrete answers precisely so that one set of solutions to how certain things should be decided in a desirable alternative to capitalism can be contrasted with and sort of stood up against other proposals that are out there. So that's the spirit in which we've offered, the proposals we've offered.
Yeah, no, yeah.
Yeah, Antti?
Yeah, and another thing is that I think what has been missing from this discussion, like Robin pointed out, is this, concrete democratic alternatives, so that it would go sort of somewhere, so that we would have discussion between different alternatives, which would be, concrete enough to have the kind of discussion that Robin mentioned. And I think that participatory economy is a really sort of important stepping stone in that, in a sense that I think hopefully it will be just sort of a ridiculed first version of how a democratic economy would work. And everyone would just, in 50 years or 100 years time, just laugh how simple and stupid and naive it was. But I hope it would start this discussion that, we need to talk about how, for example, consumption and production work in a democratic economy. And that's something that participatory economy has a concrete answer to, instead of just saying that people come together and decide. And that's been an answer for many for like 100 years or so. And that just isn't an answer that will take us anywhere. Instead, we need some sort of, how should we divide which sectors of the economy? How can people, decide on what will happen in each sector of the economy? How will different industries work? How will prices work? And yeah, I think ultimately the participatory economy will provide the kind of rough outline on what kind of questions we need answered. And I hope to see more of that.
Mitchell, let me
Yes,
add
Robin.
one thing. Let me add one thing. I think there's an important insight that anarchists bring to this discussion, which is an understanding that if there's a power vacuum, somebody will fill it.
Mhm.
And what inevitably happens is when societies are in turmoil and disruption, and we have major institutional social change, well, then there's sort of a rapid period in which sort of decisions are made about how to go about doing things differently. And if there hasn't been a lot of very careful pre-thinking about how to go about that, then in particular, what has happened for socialist economies is the bureaucracies fill the vacuum.
Mhm.
Somebody has to make the decisions, and we have to start making them now, and we're not making them the way they used to be made under capitalism. And if it's not decisions that we're simply leaving to market processes because we've discovered that the consequences of doing that, have created the problems that we were all upset about, well, then there have to be different procedures. So I think the other thing is that what anarchists have come to realize is that power will fill a vacuum. And if you want that vacuum to be filled by democratic participatory decision-making procedures, then there have to be clear ideas about how to go about doing that before some small group manages to fill a vacuum and put us back in a situation where, people are not in control of their economic destinies. There is some sort of bureaucracy, or what happened in the Soviet Union, a dictatorial communist party plus a central planning procedure took over economic decision making. And we don't want that to happen again. And nobody out there anymore wants that to happen again. But just not wanting it to happen again isn't the same as having a solution for what will prevent that from happening again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if we don't have discussion on this, then there's, unfortunately, there might be even more worse alternatives
Right.
than communism or centrally planned economies to capitalism.
Yeah.
So that, the kind of mess we're in with climate change and run amok inequality is that, there's a lot of really terrible things that could, go wrong in our society. And that's why I think now is a very important time to have the kind of discussion. There's American feminist, I think, I don't remember her name, Joe something or some. There's an essay called, now that we are talking about anarchists, I think she was an anarchist as well, or is The Tyranny of Structurelessness.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think it's written, if I remember correctly, written from a feminist point of view, talking about how family and gender relations are something that can't be left, just, vaguely in the air, but we have to actually have the concrete discussion about them. And I think this is just as important in the economy, that we have, the kind of discussion what kind of structures we want for the economy and for our democratic economy. And that's sort of my answer to why we need discussion on institutions and values that also is open-ended in the kind of way that we can build upon them, find different solutions that still adhere to the values we have, instead of just leaving it in the air and not answered just in the hopes of, gaining more people. Because a lot of people can agree and say, we don't want capitalism. I think a lot of people can agree on that, witnessing the problems we have today. but that really isn't solution to almost anything yet. So that's sort of where the discussion on democratic alternatives to capitalism comes.
I'll chime in on the question on, is a participatory economy a blueprint? I think the answer to that is yes, but in a way that I think is both helpful and not. And I'll explain what I mean by that. It is helpful in that, like a blueprint is basically a design for a house. You would, with a blueprint in hand, you know what a house that you're going to build is going to look like, it's going to work, and what it's going to, and what all the particular details of that house. But a blueprint does not tell you how to build that house. That is left to someone else to work out the details. And that's the second sense in which I think a participatory economy is like a blueprint, in that there's been this model now for 30 years since Robin and Michael Albert co-wrote the books that were published, The Participatory Economy of Political Economics and Looking Forward, that outlined in detail the proposed model of what we now call a participatory economy. But the main issue is that there has not been much in the way of commentary or, frankly, as much thinking on how they build that. And that is, I think, where the discussion, I think, should go. That we've got this economy, we've got some experimentation. Robin and I, along with others, have done some work to see that it could do what it's advertised to do. But how do we get there? How do we build that? How does it become, how do we go from the mass market slave hell that we have now into something better that we think would work and fulfill the needs of an economy, and do so in a fair and democratic way? And that we really haven't given as much time or thought to, and I think we need to. And hopefully this podcast can serve as an avenue for that. So that's what I would say on that.
Yeah, I want to say one thing about what it is we're, thinking about. What is the economic system that we would like, to eventually replace capitalism with? One tendency on the left is to say, well, we want just like we want the political decisions to be made democratically, we want economic decisions to be made democratically. And so then the tendency is, well, that means you put things to votes. And that's right, as far as it goes. And it also means, well, and you don't just put things to votes, you have to have discussions where, people make arguments for why it is that one thing would be better than another. And that's also correct as far as it goes. But one of the things that, that we have to think much more carefully about is, well, what sort of information do people need in order to even make up their own minds about what it is they think is better or worse? And that's where something called, opportunity costs and social costs of doing things comes in. And so there has to be an answer to the information problem. You want to structure debates so that they don't take up tremendous amounts of time. You want to structure debates so that they don't just come down to, well, whoever was the most stubborn and stayed till 2 a.m, gets to decide. And you want to also consider what's the information that people need to know whether or not they think it would be a good idea to do this or that, or what kind of information do I need to know about whether or not, if you have proposed that you want to do something in particular, well, is that reasonable? Is that something that you should have a right to do? Or is that going to be using resources inefficiently? And those resources belong to all of us, and they could have been used to do something else. So I think that another thing that has been a weakness on the part of people who are very firm about the fact that we want economic democracy, we want democratic decision-making about the important economic decisions that affect all our lives. One of the weaknesses has been a failure to understand what sort of information people need to do that sensibly. and how it needs to be arranged so that it doesn't take up inordinate amounts of time. And those are the kinds of things that, in thinking through various proposals we made that are part of the model, proposal, blueprint, whatever you want to call it, called a participatory economy. Those are the kinds of issues that we've taken seriously rather than just sort of ignored or not had much to say about.
This has been PEP Talk. This is the podcast where we talk about the democratic alternative to capitalism known as a participatory economy. I'm your host, Mitchell Szczepanczyk from Chicago. We've been joined by Antti Jauhiainen from Helsinki and Robin Hahnel from Portland. You can learn more about the model of a participatory economy at the website participatory-economy.org. You can join in the regular newsletter that is mailed out, as well as an online forum to discuss and bring up issues related to the topics here or suggest further topics to be brought up in this podcast. I'm Mitchell Szczepanczyk from Chicago. Thank you very much for joining. We'll see you again. Goodbye.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Self-management, democratic control of communities or workplaces, federal arrangements.
Participatory democratic planning.
Jobs to have a mix of empowered work, nested councils linked to one another. Everyone gets to participate in a primary council.
Please visit participatory-economy.org to find out more and subscribe to our newsletter. And don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks, and see you at the next episode.